in our last video where we made 1,080 horsepower. And if you haven't seen it, it's ridiculous. You've got to see it. I'll leave a link for it in the description below. But anyhow, this Jeep motor made over 1,000 horsepower on the dyno. And besides one time actually popping off the blow-off valve because it wasn't clamped on tight enough, got that fixed, it did great. The only issue that we had was being able to get enough fuel to make all the horsepower that we did. Keith Newcomer promised to let me tag along as he pulls it back apart just to make sure everything looks like it should. So this is going to be the follow-up. If you think a Jeep motor, there's no way it can make that much power and live, we're about to find out, baby. So Keith, do we have any concerns based on what we saw on the dyno before we start ripping into this? What are we looking for?
We're just going to look at everything, make sure it's healthy. Yeah, some of the main concerns in the past were, it's like stock main bolts, stock main caps, that kind of thing, that they just won't hold it. There's a lot of these preconceived notions that from certain experts that know that they're going to fail at 400 horsepower or 600 or whatever it is. So we just did it to see what it'll make, and it's not done making it yet, and it's not broke because it ran great, it had great oil pressure. So we'll take it apart and see if there's anything weird. If not, we know we can turn it up some more.
Let's get going then. So Keith, Devin Rowell, and I, although I mostly just got in the way and slowed down progress, set about tearing into the engine that just a few days before incredibly broke 1,000 horsepower on the engine dyno. Probably it should be in a museum, and I'm only partly joking about that, but its true purpose is as an R&D engine. And even if nothing was broken, Keith wanted to inspect all the components to see if there are any weaknesses or extreme wear patterns. First up, we'll drain the oil and check it for bits of bearing or piston, which will show up as shiny flakes in the oil. What oil did you run?
VR1 2050. There's not even clumps, no metal parts.
It's always nice not to see anything sparkly in there.
Yeah, so far so good.
And while Keith drained the oil, Devin pulled the very interesting turbo exhaust header setup mounted to the stock 4.0 Jeep block. So this is a Newcomer racing turbo header.
Yeah. Big honker. It was used on the previous turbo build also. And we've got an adapter pipe so that we can run an NA too, if need be.
Keith, what size is it?
2-inch, I believe.
That's 1 7/8.
Okay.
It can be tough to find performance parts for the old Jeep design, so in a lot of cases, Keith just makes his own. Now this includes the soft copper exhaust gasket used to seal the header to the cylinder head. That's also true of the full roller rocker arms Keith has made to his specs. We made several dyno pulls in excess of 6,500 RPM. So it was important to check and make sure all the Valvetrain pulled through without showing signs of stress.
I mean, we could turn this one 7,000 if we wanted to. I mean, probably more, honestly. The cam's a little small for that, but I mean, we spun it to 6,600 on the dyno, no issue.
If you had stamped rockers and everything like that, what would you be running to?
Honestly, I've hit 6 before on a stamped rocker. Now the longevity, I don't know about that. They'll end up breaking. I mean, I've broken them in the past. They'll crack the whole body. You get a lot of deflection, but they surprisingly work better than you think. They deflect a lot. That's all I can say.
All the rockers and springs still look good, and we didn't expect any problems here, but the push rods all checked out nice and straight also. Next up, the cylinder head. And let me just go ahead and apologize in advance for the upcoming shot. That under cabinet lighting really screwed up the exposure on my camera, so sorry about that.
So this head here is a head we had laying around the shop from Elder Brock, and we've done some flow testing on it, and you can get 300 plus CFM out of this. it's pretty impressive. Out of the box, they run good. They're not bad. But when you really turn up the wick, I mean, it runs good. So on this motor, we previously ran this for testing, and you know, we made like 415 out of it NA. On this one, I made like 394, as I mentioned. But we wanted to see what we could get out of this head, because if you go all through it, big valves, replace the seats, guides, everything, you end up with an astronomical amount of money. And we tried to shortcut to make it work, to make as much power as we could on the cheap. It might not be that cheap, but it's still a lot cheaper than what it would normally be. And obviously, it ran pretty good. Yeah, we're pretty happy with this. And this is something that we could offer for our normal motors, and it would sneeze and make 350 up to 450 horsepower on our normal packages, depending on the cam. The cam's the biggest factor.
So it's a ported head.
Yes.
Hand ported bigger valves.
Yep. So we snuck in a 202 160, nothing crazy. On the other videos we've had, we replaced the seats. We put in a 208 valve, really big, and it worked well. But you can still make it on a 202. It's pretty standard.
Do you remember off the top of your head what size valves came in this?
I think it's like a 191 range, 150.
You work a little magic with Edelbrock heads. If they're good when you start, they get even better with a little work. But here's proof that I'm not just blowing sunshine on this video. Everything is not perfect.
All right, so we just pulled this one apart, and as you can see, it had lifted the head. And in between the studs, the head lifted, started, blowing combustion out. But part of it, I'm not saying it wouldn't have lifted the head, but this was a used head gasket. We had already ran this motor once, we stuck it right back in. I mean, nothing special, just to see, and you can see.
But it didn't blow it out yet.
No.
How much longer do you think it would have lasted like that?
It would have lasted a while. It didn't hurt the block.
Number 4 was the big one, huh?
2, 4, and 5.
So no actual damage to the deck of the block.
No,
didn't burn it up or anything.
And that's a standard Velcro MLS gasket, like 3 or 4 layer, 41 thousandths thick. It's not a heavy one. We plan to put a heavy, thick gasket in, or if you really want to hold it, like O-ring it or groove it. But we just want to see what it would take. I mean, it took it. Or high boosted probably. Yeah, obviously it didn't take it, but still looks good in my opinion.
The whole point of R&D is to find the limits, right?
Correct.
And here you can see where the hot exhaust gases were leaking past the head. No damage here, but we did check later and found out the head was warped only about 1/1000th of an inch. So obviously the engine isn't going to make it 100,000 miles at 27 pounds of boost, but we never expected it to anyway. Now, one of the things I found most interesting was that you did this with, it's not a stock intake manifold, but it is an old casting, right, that you told me about?
Yeah, this is like a probably a 70s era Clifford intake. I mean, they were really good back in the day. This would have been on a 258, 232, something like that. And we just took it, ported it, opened it up, really as big as you can get it, as much as the casting allows. But they have some pumps inside for fueling distribution, and they just work really good. They're not the best for peak horsepower, but overall, they're really hard to beat. We could do like a custom intake. We've tested it before, like a sheet metal intake, and it'll make normally around 30 more horsepower than this intake. So, with this header that we ran, so this last time we ran it with the turbo header, which makes less power. The American Racing header made more power, so that header made around 415. The turbo header made 394, I think. But if we would have put the American Racing header and a custom intake, this thing probably would have been around that 440 range, naturally aspirated. That's pretty spicy, you know, for an old tractor motor.
Yeah, it is. And so with Jeeps not being supported like an LS or something like that, you're always having to scrounge for parts and pieces that work best for your different recipes, huh?
Always. You know, and the more you get into this stuff, the more you find out the little strange things that, you know, that'll work, and they make more power. And this is, no matter what intake you run, you end up going back to this. This is like your baseline. You just know it's going to work. You can tweak it, you know, you can port it and make upwards of 20 horsepower from porting, but even unported, you know, they work well on the older castings. The newer castings, not as much. But if you can find an old one, that's where it's at.
How many hours do you have to invest in porting an intake?
Really, that's depending on the porter. You know, like if you have a professional porter that comes in here and does this, you might have 3-4 hours into it, you know, from start to finish. If you're a novice at this, it might take you a week.
They look pretty consistent. So we've got some exhaust valves that are pretty polished right here, and then they get darker as you go out. What's the sign of that?
Fueling on that intake is going to be the issue. You know, you can only fix so much. That's the one thing. It's like, okay, we take all these things that aren't supposed to work, and we put a blow-through carburetor on top of it. That's, you know, it's meant for a certain range, just like a turbo is meant for a certain power range. The carburetor is basically the same. And I'm no professional blow-through carburetor guy. I can get it in the ballpark, and that's what we did. And we got limited to where we ran out of fuel. But, you know, if we had a better carburetor, it would have ran better down low, would have ran better up top. But obviously it was good enough to make this kind of power. But if we could have went back and ran fuel injection, we could dial all this in to where the fuels are spot on every cylinder. There's no rich cylinders, there's no lean, they're all the same. Kind of like our first video. And if we could do that, I don't know. I really think if you keep the head down on this thing, you could see 1,500 horsepower. But people thought I was crazy when I said 1,000 too, so we'll see.
Is this a stock pan?
It is, yeah.
So far, so good with the cylinder head and valve trains. Now we'll turn our attention to the bottom end.
God. It was going to leak.
One interesting difference is instead of the stock self-adjusting cam button with a spring, Keith makes a solid cam button for more precise camshaft installation. Why do you not leave it sprung?
Oh, it's solid. It's got it. You can set the back, like the end play exactly where you want it. So you set it for like 4,000-6,000, something like that. It's not going to move. The spring loaded one. I mean, it worked fine for most of them. This little extreme version, I just wanted it set so it's not going to. It's only going to move a certain amount. The spring will allow it to move more.
Okay. First up on the bottom end disassembly is to remove the stock stamp steel crank girdle. It's not the beefiest unit compared to aftermarket billet girdles, but it's still better than nothing. And like I may have already mentioned, the girdle, the main caps, and the main bolts are all completely stock. So that means they're pretty old too. Anyhow, Keith was understandably very curious to see how all this stuff stood up to 1,000+ horsepower.
Look at that.
What's your judgment?
Looks like brand new. That's just a polish. That's all.
Nice.
Yeah, it looks great.
Yeah, so if you look at these, you know, this looks worse than it actually is. That's just a coating. But if you actually look at the piston itself, it has a little bit of scratching. You got to remember, we've already ran this motor once. This was ran NA and it's been beat to death. It probably has 100 dyno pulls on it. And these have held up great. This thing, even after we got done, no huffing, no blow by, no nothing. It runs great. And for all the beating, you know, and this is a set of custom JEs that, you know, we had designed, certain dish, you know, the valve placement, the pin size is different. It's not your typical Jeep pin. It's a 866 pin, full floating, ARP 2000 bolts on a scat rod. And this will just be your normal scat rod. And they work really well. They're really robust. They obviously take a lot of power. They didn't move around. The bearings look great. What you see there is just slight polishing. That's nothing. You could take a piece of Scotch-Brite and it would look like brand new. There's no scarring at all.
That's perfect.
I don't see anything.
Nope.
Do you typically have any main bearing problems with the Jeep?
Never. Like, never. Even from the factory, they can have 300,000 miles. You take them apart, and they look just like that. No bad bearings. No broke caps. No stretched bolts.
With the stock fasteners.
Everything is stock.
Reused stock.
Wow, that's great.
All right, let's just look. It doesn't look like the caps are walking around. Let's just pull one and see. I mean, doesn't look like the bearing's moving around. Nothing crazy. Looks great. If you remember, on the previous world record motor that we did, you know, we went through a lot of pains of filling the block and you know, main girdle, and you know, if you look at it, that's things that you would want to upgrade. We did go with a bigger bore. This one we didn't. We went with this 30 over 3905, and we just kept everything basically stock. We used stock bolts, caps, everything. A normal block, nothing special. You look on the internet, you're going to see stuff such as core shift and things like that. And if you were to look at this one, if you would look at this bolt hole, it is not centered on this casting. And people would say that it had core shift and this block would be no good. Well, obviously this block is good, just like every other block we've ever had. I mean, they left the factory, they ran 200,000+ miles, and they normally still run good. Don't always trust this sign. Just saying.
All right, one last thought you were mentioning off camera before we close this story up was you mentioned how important the fuel is that you're burning on a project like this.
It is. You know, we've done a bunch of different things power-wise on this platform, other platforms, and when you get to this level, most guys say, hey, you have to run ethanol. It ends up being E90, E85, something like that. Our first video, we didn't do that. We ended up running water meth. And we had set up for water meth, and we didn't even run this on water meth. You know, you're looking at 11.8 to 1 compression on 27 pounds, no water meth, standard head gasket, and it looks this good. You know, it made that kind of power. No detonation, no issues. And we use Sunoco Max NOS. I think it's rated at 116. And they said that it was an awesome fuel. And I have to agree with them. I mean, it really is. I mean, we were very conservative on timing. But even then, I mean, that's a lot, you know, to make. And I've been impressed by a lot of things, but I was really impressed with the fuel.
And when you called me, you know, you told me this was just a pure R&D project. And so I assumed that when we were on the dyno, if things blew up into pieces, you wouldn't have been crying anyway. But given how everything turned out, now that you've torn this down and looked at everything, you've got to be beyond pleased with this recipe.
Very, yeah. And I mean, I knew that this was going to be an issue, you know, with the head gasket. I didn't think that it would take it as far as it did. You know, if this head was never meant to have nearly 30 pounds of boost, you know, and turn 6,600 RPMs, but it did. You know, it took it. You know, if you wanted to, you know, try to hold this head down better, I mean, you could use a cast iron version, you know, that's a lot stiffer and rigid. You could use a receiver groove or something. Another way, this is as basic as it gets from a gasket standpoint, off the shelf, head studs, nothing special, and it did this. Been impressive.
Yeah. Keith, I appreciate you letting us tag along, and I cannot wait to see how you take this information you've gained from this project and turn it into next.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Hey, thanks for watching. Leave a comment below and let me know if you like these R&D teardowns. And maybe buy a t-shirt. They're dope. See you next time.